On June the 15th, 1977, A Bridge Too Far premiered at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Based on the 1974 book by historian Cornelius Ryan and directed by Richard Attenborough, the film told the story of Operation Market Garden, the Allies' ambitious but doomed airborne assault against Nazi-occupied Holland in September of 1944. An epic in every sense of the word, the film boasted massive battle sequences featuring hundreds of real tanks, aircraft, and parachutists, and a veritable who's who of 1970s A-list actors, including Sean Connery, Gene Hackman, Robert Redford, James Caan, Elliott Gould, Anthony Hopkins, Dirk Bogarde, and Laurence Olivier. Yet despite its grand scale and star-studded cast, the film received mixed reviews upon release. And like every other film released in the summer of 1977, was absolutely trounced at the box office by an obscure little indie film about a boy who meets an old hermit who convinces the boy to run away with him and join his cult. Then, almost immediately, starts having the boy play with his sword in front of him, including sensory deprivation play via a blast shield, all the while continually urging the boy to use more force when playing with his sword. Later, the boy joins a group of terrorists who murder just under 1.7 million military personnel and another 250,000 civilian staff that were just doing their jobs aboard the space station they worked at. And then we're pretty sure he bones his sister. In more recent years, however, A Bridge Too Far has been reappraised and is now considered a classic, drawing particular praise for its epic battle sequences, its largely accurate and sensitive handling of real history, and its memorable characters. Perhaps the most memorable of all is Major Harry Carlyle, played by actor Christopher Good, who carries an umbrella into battle to prove he is an Englishman since, as he explains, he can never remember passwords. But while such an eccentric character trait might seem like the invention of a particularly creative Hollywood screenwriter, incredibly, Major Carlyle is based on a real British paratrooper who really did charge into battle wielding an umbrella. What's more, the film barely scratches the surface of the real man's legendary exploits. So let's correct that, shall we? This is the absurd and rather legendary tale of Major Digby Warter, the most British soldier to ever British soldier. So let's dive into it all, shall we? Alison Digby Warter, known to those who knew him simply as Digby, was born on May the 21st, 1917 in Arkham, Shropshire, the second son of landowner Henry de Grey Warter. Digby's father was a member of the Artist Rifles, an Army Reserve unit today known as the 21st Special Air Service Regiment, and served in France during the First World War, being wounded by poison gas in combat. Though he survived and returned home, this ultimately led to his premature death in 1928. As for young Digby, he was educated at Wellington College in Berkshire, and in 1935 was accepted into the prestigious Royal Military College, Sandhurst. Here, Digby distinguished himself, winning accolades for his exceptional equestrian skills and graduating on January the 21st, 1937 with the rank of second lieutenant. He was then attached to the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, aka the Ox and Bucks, and dispatched to India, but never officially joined the Indian Army. This suited Digby perfectly, as the relaxed lifestyle allowed him plenty of time to indulge in his favorite hobbies of polo, tiger and boar hunting, or pig sticking, one occasion single-handedly killing 3 wild boar weighing 70 kilos each. Following the outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939, Digby returned to England but was not immediately deployed to fight. The rest of his family, however, did see action, with his sister Kit winning the French War Cross while serving as a nurse in the Hatfield Spears ambulance unit in North African desert. His older brother John also served in this theater in the 2nd Dragoon Guards, the Queen Beys, being killed in action in November of 1942. John's death spurred Digby to seek a more active combat posting, and he volunteered for the newly formed Parachute Regiment. On October the 12th, 1943, he was appointed company commander of a company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion and sent to Grantham, Lincolnshire for training. The 2nd Parachute Battalion was at the time commanded by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, who, in February of 1942, had successfully led the fledgling Paras on one of their first major missions, Operation Biting, a daring raid to capture parts of the German radar set near Brunaville, France. Like Digby, he would gain even greater glory when the Paras jumped into Holland 2 years later. At Grantham, Digby quickly became a local legend. Not only were his tiger hunting exploits in India well known, but he also used his connections to secure an American Douglas C-47 transport to take him and his fellow officers to London for lavish parties at the Ritz Hotel. These evenings were often the scene of drunken fistfights between Digby and his fellow officers, but the eccentric officer always managed to return to his unit the following day sober and immaculately dressed. Indeed, while the film, A Bridge Too Far, depicts the fictional Digby as something of a toff and a buffoon, the real man was remembered as a particularly strict and demanding commander, albeit one who inspired fierce loyalty in the men under his command. Major Victor Dover of C Company described him as a cool, calm, and collected man. He was tall, a little aloof, and full of confidence. While his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frost, remembered him as a Prince Rupert of a man. He would have been a great cavalry commander on the King's side in the war with the Roundheads. While the 2nd Parachute Battalion was not involved in the Operation Overlord landings in Normandy in June of 1944, in August of that year they received an even greater combat assignment, Operation Market Garden. The brainchild of British Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, Market Garden was aimed at liberating Nazi-occupied Holland and allowing Allied forces to cross the Rhine River into Germany, ending the war by Christmas. The market component of the plan called for 3 divisions of the 1st Allied Airborne Army to be dropped in an airborne carpet along Highway 69, a 100-kilometer stretch of raised road leading from Eindhoven in the south to Arnhem in the north. These airborne forces were tasked with assaulting and holding key bridges along the highway. Once these objectives were secured, 10 mechanized brigades of the British Second Army's 30th, 8th, and 9th Corps under Generals Brian Horrocks and Miles Dempsey would cross the Belgian-Dutch border and race up the highway, linking up with and relieving each airborne contingent along the narrow corridor. It was a bold but extremely risky plan. Highway 69 was surrounded on both sides by flooded polder land and heavily wooded dikes, which would make the advancing Allied motorized corps extremely vulnerable to enemy ambush. The lightly equipped airborne troops could also only defend their objectives for a few days at most, making any delays in the ground army's arrival potentially disastrous. And if any one airborne unit failed to secure its assigned objective, it would spell failure for the entire operation. Nonetheless, Montgomery, keen to reinvigorate the Allies flagging in the wake of the Normandy breakout, pushed forward with his plan, setting D-Day for September of 1944. Now, during training for Market Garden, it was feared that the low-lying flooded landscape of southern Holland would reduce the effectiveness of the airborne forces' radio sets. Displaying characteristic out-of-the-box thinking, Digby Warter thus trained his men in the use of bugle calls for communication, as had been used during the Napoleonic Wars. It was also around this time that Digby adopted his infamous affectation of carrying an umbrella into battle. Just like his fictionalized counterpart, the real-life Digby had difficulty remembering official passwords and reasoned that, to quote him, it would be quite obvious to anyone that the bloody fool carrying the umbrella could only be an Englishman. Operation Market Garden finally got underway on September the 17th, 1944, with some 4,600 aircraft dropping 35,000 airborne troops over southern Holland. It was the largest airborne assault ever mounted up to this point, and only the 2nd largest in history after Operation Varsity, the Allied crossing of the Rhine River on March the 24th, 1945. But while American airborne forces to the south succeeded in capturing their objectives with little difficulty, the situation for the British around Arnhem was considerably more fraught. Due to a shortage of aircraft, only half of the British 1st Airborne Division could be dropped in the first wave. Even worse, while Allied decrypts of enciphered German Enigma machine traffic had indicated that several SS Panzer divisions had moved into the Arnhem area, Field Marshal Montgomery and other top Allied officers minimized or outright ignored this intelligence, and the market forces jumped into Holland believing they would only be opposed by second-line troops and poorly trained members of the Volkssturm militia. In the event, however, the intelligence turned out to be accurate, and the airborne carpet was dropped right on top of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the Parachute Army under Colonel General Kurt Student. Many of the British units who had been dropped in broad daylight were thus forced to defend their drop zones through the night until they could be reinforced by the second wave the following day. A special glider-borne reconnaissance squadron of jeeps armed with twin Vickers K air-cooled machine guns was also supposed to race ahead to scout and secure the bridgehead, but these vehicles either failed to arrive altogether or faced unexpectedly stiff resistance and could advance no further. Thus fell to less than half a brigade of British paras to reach Arnhem Bridge on foot. This advance, too, suffered from poor planning. Due to flooded fields and heavy German anti-aircraft artillery around the city center, the Paras had to be dropped some 11 kilometers from the bridge, denying them the element of surprise and forcing them to advance across open ground and a heavily built-up city crawling with German troops. Nonetheless, Digby and A Company succeeded in covering the distance in only 7 hours, keeping to back gardens and side streets to avoid the bulk of the defenders. Even more impressive, along the way they captured an astonishing 150 people, mainly members of the dreaded Waffen-SS. Unfortunately, Digby's fears about the reliability of the radios proved well-founded. Indeed, poor radio communication would play a major role in the ultimate failure of Market Garden. However, to his delight, the bugle calls proved surprisingly effective and remained a useful tool throughout the operation, allowing scattered units to communicate clearly above the roar of cannon and mortar fire. Finally, just after dusk, the Paras reached the road bridge over the Rhine and established a defensive pocket around its southern end, having lost only 1 man killed and a handful wounded during their masterful advance. But their triumph was short-lived, for the following day, Lieutenant Colonel Frost's men came under assault by elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, against whose heavily armored Tiger and Panther tanks, their light 6-pound guns and projector infantry anti-tank spigot mortars were largely ineffective. Nonetheless, the Paras put up a ferocious fight, and assault after assault across the bridge was successfully repulsed. And amidst all this chaos and death, Digby Warter, appointed commander of the 2nd Battalion after the death of Major David Wallace, remained a beacon of calm and dependable leadership, continually patrolling the defensive perimeter and keeping up his men's spirits despite the constant danger of sniper and mortar fire. As brigade commander, Brigadier Gerald Lathbury later recalled, "When the colonel was seriously wounded and the second in command killed, he did a magnificent job moving around the district freely and was so cool that on one occasion he arrived at the door of a house simultaneously with 2 German soldiers and allowed them to stand back to let him go in first." Digby also led several desperate bayonet charges against the assaulting German forces, waving his umbrella and wearing a jaunty bowler hat he had found in the rubble in place of his steel helmet or maroon beret. The umbrella wasn't just for show, however, as he at one point managed to disable a German armored car by shoving his umbrella through a vision slit and poking the driver in the eye. More absolutely mad lad antics soon followed. On one occasion, Digby spotted Father Bernard Egan, the battalion chaplain, pinned down by enemy fire. Running over to the man, he cheerfully announced, "Come on, Padre, don't worry about the bullets, I've got an umbrella," before escorting Egan across the street to a cellar full of wounded and dying men. And when Lieutenant Pat Barnett commented on his trademark accessory, "That thing won't do you any good," the unflappable Digby replied, "Oh my goodness, Pat, what if it rains?" In another now legendary incident faithfully depicted in A Bridge Too Far, a German soldier approached under a white flag to negotiate a surrender, only for Digby to pithily announce that he hadn't the facilities to take the Germans prisoner, and so the battle raged on. Yet in spite of his dogged defiance, the besieged Paras were quickly running out of food, water, medicine, and ammunition, and many of the men were badly wounded. Digby himself received several minor shrapnel wounds to his English backside and arm, but characteristically shrugged them off, even playfully hanging his umbrella from his arm sling. Nonetheless, it soon became clear that the defenders could not hold out for much longer. The 30th Corps was originally scheduled to reach Arnhem in 1 to 2 days, but by the 20th of September, they were still nowhere to be seen. As feared, the narrow, elevated Highway 69 turned into a shooting gallery for the defending Germans, earning the road the nickname of Hell's Highway. Destroyed or damaged vehicles littered the road, causing kilometers-long traffic jams and grinding the advance to a crawl. Even worse, the Germans destroyed several bridges along the corridor, forcing military engineers to assemble pontoon or Bailey bridges and causing further delays. Operation Market Garden was swiftly unraveling. And so it was that on the evening of September the 20th, Lieutenant Colonel Frost decided that his position was untenable and ordered his men to disperse and make their way out of Arnhem to Oosterbeek. Unfortunately, at this point, the Paras were completely surrounded, and all but a few were either killed or captured in the attempt. However, unlike his fictionalized counterpart in A Bridge Too Far, the real Digby did not die at Arnhem Bridge, but was rather captured while trying to flee the city. He states, "We advanced into Arnhem and held the bridge there until 2200 on September the 20th. During the night, the battalion was split up by enemy action, and on the morning of the 21st September, we were no longer a fighting force. I ordered the remainder of the force to evade capture until help should arrive. I had been injured by a blast and I had hid in a deep drain with Captain McLean of my division. We were discovered and captured by the Germans at 1000 hours on September the 21st. We were taken to a church in Arnhem where we saw about 90 men of our division, including Captain Frank, who was wounded. At 1800 hours, Captain Frank and I were taken to a hospital in Arnhem where we met Major Crawley and Captain Logan, both of my division. Captain Frank and I discussed escape plans with Captain Logan. At 2200 hours on the 21st of September, Captain Frank and I climbed through a window of the hospital and crawled northwest through the hospital gardens to a wood. We then walked west until daylight when we arrived at a farm. Having eaten nothing for days but a potato and a slice of bread at the German hospital, the two men risked knocking at the door in the hopes of finding more food. They were answered by a Dutch woman who, despite speaking no English and initially being frightened by the men's rough appearance, eventually took them in and gave them food and beds. The next day, she introduced them to two local leaders of the Dutch resistance, Dirk Bogarde and Menno de Nooy, who provided Digby with a bicycle, a new set of clothes, a haircut, and forged documents identifying him as Peter Jensen, a conveniently deaf-mute house painter from The Hague. Thus disguised, Digby and Bogarde cycled around the countryside, rounding up other escaped paras and hiding them on resistance-controlled farms, all while a group of Waffen-SS soldiers were billeted at the same house where Digby was staying. Indeed, so confident was Digby in his assumed identity that upon coming across a German staff car which had skidded off the road into a ditch, he states, "As the officer seemed to be in an excitable state, we thought it wise to help push their car out and back onto the road. They were gracious enough to thank us for our help." At the same time, Digby established telephone contact with Nijmegen and every evening communicated with Harry Neve, the first British prisoner of war to escape from the infamous Coldus Castle and who is now working for MI9, the organization tasked with helping Allied escapees and evaders return to Allied lines. As Neve later wrote in his 1953 memoir, They Have Their Exits, the power stations in Nijmegen on the Waal and at Ada on the northern bank of the Rhine were linked by private telephone lines which remained intact while the battle raged. The exchanges were controlled by the resistance and they gave us the information that in the houses and forests of Ada were hidden nearly 140 men, among them Major Digby Tatham Warter, DSO. This officer, a man of calm ingenuity, conducted the conversations that followed between the two power stations. Despite the risk of capture, he came from his hiding place each evening between 9 and 10 to the terminal house at Ada and there spoke to the rescue organizations in Nijmegen. He passed to those on duties in power station lists of names of survivors of the Great Airborne Landing, which included Brigadier Lathbury, commanding the 1st Parachute Brigade. During the first 2 weeks of October of 1944, I sat every evening in the Gaunt Power Station with Major Hugh Fraser, MBE of the SAS, now MP for Stafford, listening for the telephone bell. It seemed that we were waiting for a signal from the other world. The shells from enemy batteries at Arnhem crashed around the Nijmegen Bridge, shaking the powerhouse. Besides us sat technical officials, their staunch Dutch faces betraying no emotion. We would wait with beating hearts for a faint ring on the telephone and Tatham Warter's voice. Through Neve, Digby arranged for the Royal Air Force to drop containers of weapons, ammunition, food, and other supplies, which were buried around the countryside. The intention was for Digby's para-evaders and the Dutch resistance to form a small army and assault German positions should the Allies attempt to cross the Rhine again. However, when it became clear that such an assault would not take place anytime soon, Digby changed his plan and instead launched a bold escape mission codenamed Operation Pegasus. At 9 p.m. on October the 22nd, 1944, Digby, along with 138 men, including paras, downed airmen, a handful of Russians, and even an Indonesian officer of the Royal Netherlands Navy, set out on foot and bicycle towards the Rhenium Woods on the banks of the Rhine, the pedestrians' boots wrapped in blankets to dull their footsteps. Despite passing nearly 200 enemy soldiers and sounding, in Digby's recollection, like a herd of stampeding elephants, the men were never challenged, and 4.5 hours later, they successfully rendezvoused with the 30th Corps and were safely ferried across the river to Allied lines. Upon returning to England, Digby was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, or DSO, for his exceptional leadership, the citation for which read, "Major Tatham Warter commanded a company of 2 para-battalion which dropped west of Arnhem in Holland on September the 17th. The task of the battalion was the vital one of capturing the main Rhine bridge, and the officer handled the leading company with such dash and skill that the bridge was in our hands before dark after considerable casualties had been inflicted inflicted on the enemy and 30 prisoners captured. Later, when the commanding officer took command of all forces on the bridge, Major Tatham Warder assumed command of the battalion. He commanded during the next 3 days when the battalion, without any resupply of food or ammunition, resisted incessant and determined attacks by vastly superior forces, including tanks. Throughout this period, Major Tatham Warder displayed magnificent qualities of courage, leadership, and the utmost determination. He was to be found invariably at the most threatening point in the defense, where his personal example was an inspiration to all. On one occasion, he was rendered unconscious by blast from an 88mm tank gun firing point blank at the house he was in, but he recovered and resumed command. Later, when captured by the enemy, he escaped and showed great initiative in making contact with the Dutch resistance organization. He organized and assembled a force of 100 escaped airborne troops so that they could play their part when the Germans should begin to withdraw. Finally, when orders were received to withdraw this party through the German lines, Major Tatham Warder was largely responsible for the planning of the most brilliant and successful operation in which 130 armed men escaped through the German lines and crossed the Rhine. For a month behind German lines, this officer moved about regardless of his personal safety and was an inspiration to all those who saw him. Though it did succeed in liberating a considerable area of southern Holland, Operation Market Garden proved a costly failure. Thanks to a combination of poor planning, faulty intelligence, bad weather, unexpectedly strong enemy resistance, and unreliable communications, the operation failed to secure the coveted bridge across the Rhine River and resulted in more than 17,000 Allied personnel being killed, wounded, or captured, and 88 tanks and 377 aircraft destroyed. General Frederick Boy Browning, commander of the British 1st Airborne Division, later admitted that the plan had been overly ambitious, famously stating that we might have gone a bridge too far. Allied forces did not cross the Rhine into Germany until Operation Plunder on March 23, 1945, while the Netherlands were not fully liberated until the following month. Much of this fighting was carried out by Canadian troops, establishing a long-standing friendship between the two countries. For Digby Tatham Warder, Operation Market Garden was to prove his first and last wartime combat assignment. After the war, he served briefly in the British Mandate of Palestine before moving to Kenya, where he was appointed to the 5th King's African Rifles. He later purchased a large estate at Eberu and in 1949 married Jane Boyd, daughter of Kenyan farmer Captain Roderick Boyd, with whom he had 3 daughters, Caroline, Joanna, and Belinda. During the 1952 to 1960 Mau Mau Uprising, a brutal conflict between British colonial forces and the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, better known as the Mau Mau, Digby raised a volunteer mounted police force nicknamed the Mau Mau Mounties to maintain law and order. When the rebellion was finally put down, Digby resigned his commission and retired to his estate. He later moved to another farm at Laikipia, where he pursued various hobbies including hunting, fishing, polo, sailing, and woodworking, and along with Colonel Hilary Hook, established one of the world's first modern safari outfits, encouraging his clients to shoot the local wildlife not with rifles, but with cameras. Ever eccentric and charmingly old-fashioned, Digby became a beloved fixture of the local community, so much so that when Kenya finally gained its independence in 1963, the British Defense Staff instructed the British High Commissioner to look after Tatham Warder. Ultimately, as in all humans except Paul Rudd and Keanu Reeves, age and ill health soon began to catch up with Digby, and he was gradually forced to give up his safari service and other passions in favor of less strenuous hobbies. Yet he maintained his wry sense of humor until the very end, finally passing away on March 21st, 1993 at the age of 75. Though largely remembered today for his quintessentially British eccentricities and absurd heroics during the Battle of Arnhem, to those who served alongside him, Digby Tatham Warder was more than just umbrellas, bowler hats, and pithy quips. He was an officer's officer, fearless and utterly devoted to the well-being of his men. Perhaps nobody summarized Tatham Warder's unique legacy better than his former commanding officer, Gerald Lathbury, who once declared, "Every battalion needs a Digby."